Okay, this is Dan Whitman. It's January 21st, 2024. And wow, are we fortunate to have Rick Ruth with us today. Some of you heard some comments I made last week. Rick Ruth was behind the scenes, um, assisting public diplomacy to flourish in good times and bad in the United States. This meant having political savvy, having administrative savvy, and being crazy committed to a valuable cause that many people overlook. Today, we want to get a bit of the history, if I can call it history, going back 30, 40 years now. In the United States, I think we all know that there are some political forces who, above all, want to save money. And I believe they're not intrinsically opposed to public diplomacy, but it's not high on their priority list. One of Rick's jobs was to make regular visits to the Congress, of course, being the source of funding, and to present, not to argue, but to present to them the reasons why the United States government should give financial support to public diplomacy. Today, I hope we can talk about a definition. What is public diplomacy? How does it differ from propaganda? That's not an easy question. And we'll get into some other questions. Rick Ruth, thank you for being here. And let's hear what's on your mind these days. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. The first thing on my mind, since I'm not Mr. Technology, is, am I coming through visually?
You're coming through perfectly. Yep.
Okay,
and as should be, you've taken up most of the screen. That's the way we want it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for those kind words. Again, I like the idea of having a conversation with a group of interested people. I've often spoken to groups that I think were dragooned or hauled into, force marched into an auditorium.
Not the case. Not the case today.
Or not.
Yeah.
Public diplomacy. What is it? Why do we do it? It's actually pretty straightforward. There are, of course, a lot of books on public diplomacy, which make the subject extremely complex, but that's what academics do, bless their hearts, that they have to make a living. But actually, public diplomacy is not all that complicated. In a sense, without being facetious, public diplomacy is diplomacy in public. It doesn't get a whole lot more complex than that. You obviously know that the term public diplomacy was devised to set it apart from traditional diplomacy, which, is typically conducted behind closed doors. So when Secretary of State Blinken meets with your foreign minister or your ambassador, it's behind closed doors. It's all, it may be secret, it's confidential, it's certainly not public. What we do is public. And the term public diplomacy in the modern sense was coined by Professor Ed Gullion at Tufts University some decades back. And I think the more interesting term, and I know Dan has introduced you to this, is the term soft power, which was developed by the academic Joseph Nye some years ago. And by soft power, he meant the things that are attractive about a nation or a society, the things that draw you to it voluntarily. You want to associate your country, your society, yourself with this other country. And that can be through art, through sports, through language, through culture of all kinds, through common cause. Because countries, just like people, need allies, they need friends, and they seek community. Obviously, dictatorships don't. They want to be feared and obeyed. But normal countries are looking for cooperation. They want tourism, trade, investment, travel. There are common causes, whether that's global climate change, whether that's fighting transnational crime, whatever the common cause might be. You want friends and allies to assist you with that. And the single greatest benefit, of course, from a good public diplomacy, a successful public diplomacy, is that a country, a society, has in fact peace, prosperity, security. That's the ultimate goal that you're looking for through public diplomacy, and you're using so-called soft power rather than hard power, which of course is military or tough economic sanctions or something along those lines. Joseph Nye himself, you may know, commented on the fact that the term soft power got converted some years back into the term smart power, because, as he said in his remarks, nobody in Washington, no politician in Washington wants to be in favor of something soft. That never works out. So hard has already been taken. So it became smart power. And that's perfectly fine too. Not every country engages in public diplomacy. Certainly not in global public diplomacy. That tends to be the larger countries, the so-called superpowers, the United States, Russia, China. But, there are regional public diplomacy efforts. One thinks of Iran, Brazil, Australia, India, so forth, that have a more focused public diplomacy rather than a global one. But they all do it for the same general reasons that we were just talking about, for the overall benefit of the country and for peace and prosperity. I hear myself going on too long, so in Dan Whitman just turned into a lovely picture of cherry blossoms. You're back.
That's
Dan.
me. That I had to remove my jacket. I'm in a very hot room here. I'm apologies to all.
So let me pause there because I'm going on too far, and I'd rather have questions or make sure I'm going in directions that are useful.
Well, addressing everybody, we now have a good 15 people. The two names that Rick Ruth mentions, Ed Gullion and Joseph Nye, he correctly identifies them as academics, but both of them actually came out of a military career. I believe, was Gullion not SACEUR? I think he was at one point.
He was,
yeah. Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe. And I've it's an irony, isn't it, that some of the greatest advocates of soft power come from the military. We got to meet Robert Gates a couple of months ago, Rick, and we all know that Gates is one of the greatest advocates of soft power or public diplomacy. I believe it's his quote, if you don't give them more funding, you'll have to give me more bullets. Wasn't that a Bob Gates quote?
Several generals have said that. Most recently, former Secretary of Defense, so-called Mad Dog Mattis.
Mattis also. I believe Gates, whom we met, was he's very passionate about this. I don't know if Rick has seen the study that Gates put out, a very serious study of the state of public diplomacy now. Just one other reflection. I actually want to get one of our foci here, and Rick has mentioned this in our emails together. We're very interested in what other countries are doing in public diplomacy, and especially with Ukraine. We might get some comments from Rick on what the United States government is doing with regard to public diplomacy in Ukraine. We also would like anybody on this call, any of us, I would encourage you to have reflections about what Ukraine is doing. And I see Maria has a hand up. Let me just add that Nye, in his book, Soft Power, did actually define three: hard, soft, and smart. And as Rick reminds us, in American politics, an American politician cannot use the word soft. I had a short conversation once with Nye himself, because Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, referred to everything we're talking about as smart power. Really, it's soft power, according to Nye's definition. And Nye said in response, very gracious man, he said, well, I guess smart is big enough to include soft. And so he, as Rick has also taken the tone of, it doesn't really matter what label we put on this. We just want to keep it going, and we have an interest in keeping it going. Rick has lots more to tell us about the history of public diplomacy in the U.S. and how various people, including him, assisted it in surviving and flourishing. Let's hear first from Maria. Your thoughts, Maria?
I have more of a question rather than my personal reflection.
That's fine.
And I would say that we talked a little bit about how we as countries want to be perceived, how we can use soft and smart power to be more influential towards others. But what about the public diplomacy of other countries, in particular dictatorships or authoritarian countries? Because I've heard an interesting, in my opinion, a phrase that dictatorships often tell us in advance what their plans are, and they are quite open in their rhetoric. They don't hide that much what their interests are and so on. But oftentimes we discard their rhetoric to, I don't know, to persuade ourselves that this is just uh, nothing more than words, that this will not be implemented into reality. But as we saw, Russia was quite open about its feelings towards Ukraine after 2014. And if we analyze the rhetoric, we can see like a prediction of its future actions.
That's a great comment, Maria. And we know that many countries made the terrible mistake of not listening. When Putin began his talk about the decline of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century and so forth. One of the ironies, of course, is that it was the U.S., I'm quite sure, assisted by the CIA, which predicted the invasion of February 22. Putin, in fact, Lavrov, the day of the invasion, he said publicly, there's no way, it's impossible. We would never engage in a military action. So, Maria, you raise a very interesting paradox. They say a lot about things that may not be true, and they say very little about things that may be true. I see Rick is taking notes. How do you respond to Maria, Rick?
Sure, no, excellent comment. Thank you very much, Maria. It brings up several interesting connected points. One is, as I mentioned at the outset, not every country is interested in being liked or admired. Some countries just want to be feared and obeyed. And whether or not the conduct of their public diplomacy actually fits the definition of public diplomacy is something worth discussing. It might not, in fact, be public diplomacy. It's just propaganda and aggression. You can take it or leave it. But two related points. I'm fond of saying, perhaps too fond, of saying that dictatorships can win sprints, but democracies win marathons. Now, one of the reasons that dictatorships can win sprints, that they always look somehow more agile, sharper, tougher, quicker, faster, more resolute than democracies, which always seem to be dithering and electing and squabbling among themselves, is because, of course, as you well know, a dictator has no independent legislature he has to deal with, the way that, for example, in the United States or Ukraine, the president has to deal with the legislature, the Congress, the parliament. They don't have an independent judiciary, which can strike down their laws if they find them improper or unconstitutional. They don't have an independent media to criticize them or watch them or expose what they're doing. They don't have independent public opinion. Putin doesn't care about courts or legislatures or public opinion. But in a democracy, you have to should and have to pay attention to those things. And that, in a global sense, in a hard power sense, that slows us down. But in a soft power sense or a smart power, it actually helps us in the long run. Because, again, this notion of sprints versus marathons, my sense is, and I would argue this, and happy to be disagreed with, that typically democracies will win in the end if they stay resolute to the values of democracy. And of course, you have to have strong defense that goes with it. You have to have a strong military. but there will always be threats from the outside. And just the fact that democracies prevail in the marathon doesn't mean dictatorships will ever go away. It's too deeply ingrained in the human character, and there will always be dictatorships, as there have been in the past. There will be in the future. That struggle of various sides in human nature, angels and demons, will always continue to go on. But the key thing is for democracies to not lose faith in the democratic process and think that to fight to fight dictatorships, they have to become like dictatorships. Dictatorships have several, but at least one fatal flaw, and that is, like an economy that only has one product or one agricultural product, it lives or dies on that one product. Dictatorships tend to have one product. They have Putin. That's it. They live or die on his success, his popularity, his ability, his staying power. As we saw with the fall of the Soviet Union, these things can collapse very quickly because they have no established structure throughout society of support for that regime. It is propped up internally through fear and force. And when those props are kicked out, it collapses. I'll tell you, as someone who's followed the Soviet Union and Russia for more than 50 years, I first went there in 1975, that I would have sworn to you on the stack of anything holy, Bibles, anything else, that that I would never, ever live to see the day when there was no Soviet Union in the world. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was so vast, obviously the largest country in the world, second largest, first largest, depending on how you calculate these things, military in the world, put the first man in space. They had the Warsaw Pact. I mean, they were a fearsome global power, and yet they disappeared in historic terms in almost a heartbeat, and they were gone because they had no established structure or participation from their citizens, much less any allies. And so when the dictatorship collapsed, it all collapsed. That doesn't help you today or tomorrow, but we're talking in broad historic terms here. We're talking about public diplomacy. So I want to thank you for that excellent comment.
Yeah. I want to ask or I have a couple of comments. I want to lead up to the following question, but first say a few other things. When I was trying to do public diplomacy in the field some years ago, it seemed to me that public diplomacy exists on a graph in two different lines. It exists in a horizontal line, which is mass communication, reaching the greatest number of people possible. In the old days, we did this with press releases and press conferences, and obviously now with social media. I call that horizontal. At the same time, well-inspired public diplomacy has a vertical line, which I think of as the contact with other humans, which is profound and deep and has a much greater effect on the person. These would be much smaller numbers of people, but much deeper experiences. In fact, let me just go to that question, Rick. There are many debates. This is the debate that never stops among public diplomacy practitioners. Should one reach the greatest number of people with an X or a tweet or a TikTok, which will be quickly forgotten, I would add, rather than use the vertical formula, which actually putting an individual on an airplane, we know that has a greater effect, but we can't pay in great numbers for that sort of thing. Can you comment on vertical and horizontal, Rick, Ruth?
It does get back to the sprint versus the marathon, because one of the downsides, let's assume that people agree that, that dictatorships win sprints and democracies win marathons. What happens is that if you're the democracy and you're running the marathon, you have to run around that track 500 times. While you're running around that track, meanwhile, you can hear that the dictatorship just won the 100-meter dash, and the dictatorship just won the 200-meter dash. And you hear the cheering and the crowds, and you hear the national anthem of Russia playing, or China, or wherever it is, and the crowds cheering. And you're still doing lap number 372. So the part of the problem with is that because democracies move slowly, because they have to be accountable to law, because they have to be accountable to publics and others, because they have to argue these things out amongst themselves and have differences of opinion. It looks, meanwhile, as I said, it looks like, as we say in English, like the dictatorships are eating our lunch, like they're faster, tougher, stronger, and we're losing while they're winning. But to give you the quick World War II example, if this was January 22nd, 1942, I would have been convinced that the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, would win World War II. You know, the Germans marched into Paris, the Japanese took everything from south down to Singapore, and we were doomed. But sometimes democracies act slowly, but eventually can prevail. But another way of looking at this, of course, is that you have to take the time in a sort of a medical sense. You can't chase after the symptoms, you have to chase after the causes of the infection. What do I mean by that? All right, let us concede that the Russians who spread disinformation are evil geniuses at what they do. They are very, very good at spreading lies. They're like fountains that gush day and night with nothing but lies. What do we do about that? Well, the Russians themselves have a saying you may be familiar with: don't chase after two rabbits at the same time. It's like in politics. If all you do is try and rebut and counter the argument your opponent is making, you never make your case. You never say what you think. You're always busy fighting back, counterpunching. Well, we have to do some of that. Sometimes, you know, lies from other countries, you have to tell the truth. You have to rebut them. You have to argue against them. But you can't just do that. You have to look at the deeper cause. So instead of just taking aspirin when something hurts, you have to take antibiotics to do away with whatever the infection is, the contagion. And so that gets us back to things that work slower, like education, media literacy, digital literacy, you know, foreign language training, educational exchange, cooperation between countries. These things work slowly and they take time, but they're powerfully effective over time. And the main difficulty often is that in democracies where you have elections every so often, in America, we're in the middle of one all the time because we have leaders that are elected for 2 years, 4 years, and 6 years. So there's always an election going on. You have to remember that news about opposing Russia, opposing violence, opposing injustice in the world doesn't fit in an election cycle. So if we bring young Ukrainians to the United States on the Fulbright program, which we do, and they study and eventually they go forward in Ukrainian society for the benefit of Ukraine and the United States and others, none of that fits into a presidential election campaign. No candidate for president can say, we brought some Ukrainian, you know, undergraduate students over the United States, and one of these days they'll make their mark. Well, that's all true, but it doesn't help you when the headline is all about war and violence and conflict. So a democracy, a coalition of democracies, has to do both things. You have to do the counterpunching to say, no, that's a lie. Here's the truth of this matter. But you also have to do the slow, steady work over years and sometimes decades to build up the strengths and the alliances that will be required to prevail in the end. That's one of the key parts of public diplomacy, is that constant, steady effort, which I know it's a term Dan likes. Diplomacy is gardening. And I would mention that, of course, we talk about cultural exchange and culture. Well, culture is the same word as in agriculture. It means to care for, to nurture, to develop. And that takes time, as every farmer knows, and every diplomat knows. Anyway,
you have somehow peered into my brain, Rick. Diplomacy is gardening. I hope that some of what Rick is saying resonates in light of our earlier reading of George F. Kennan, who in his long telegram and in his X article, Rick uses the phrase, stay resolute. This is what containment was all about. Kennan, I believe he even said, I did not know when the Soviet Union would collapse, but I did know that if we keep our values and stay true to ourselves, at some point, we will prevail over the Soviet Union. And he was right. We've heard this argument a couple of times last fall, that simply keeping steady, remembering, taking our own values seriously may get us to prevail in a struggle like the Cold War or now with the Russian Federation. And let me remind the group, when in making these distinctions, it's not a trivial distinction, soft, smart, and hard. Smart, if you remember when we spoke with Max Bergman about economic sanctions, I believe that would be an example of smart power. It's not kinetic. It doesn't kill people. It's not merely putting on a positive image. It's something in between, which can be very effective as a tool, frankly, as a tool of belligerence, as a way to change the other party's behavior, not voluntarily, as would be the case with soft power, but through the use of some penalties, some punishments that will alter their behavior. So these, although these terms have lost their meaning, as Rick says, very few no American politician would ever talk about soft power. But the distinction is important because some things that governments do are confrontational, and some things are not. I believe soft power, as Rick says, is the ability to make your system and your society attractive to others. Let's see. Now, Rick, with your elegant Russian just now, you remind us of your personal profound knowledge of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to let that go. You were there in 1975, and I believe it was your experience with the exhibit program that inspired you to get into this business. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was that program and why was it so appealing to you personally?
Well, thank you, Dan. Yes, in 1975, there was for a period of about 20 years, starting under President Nixon back in, gosh, whenever that was.
1974 is when he resigned, so it would have been 68, yeah.
The United States government sponsored a series of traveling exhibits about life in the United States around the Soviet Union. And it's worth mentioning that it was a bilateral agreement. So there was also an exhibit about the Soviet Union traveling around the United States. And they were equivalent because the Soviets are very big on what they call strict reciprocity. But only, of course, when it works in their favor. So there would be an exhibit about some aspect of life in the United States. It was always something innocuous, something harmless, if you will, on the surface. So it would be, in the case of the exhibit I went on, it was called Housing in the United States. But there was one on photography, one on education, one on recreation. Because, of course, the Soviet government would never have allowed an exhibit about religion in the United States. So it had to be an innocuous topic. But what the guides, as they were called, the exhibit guides, spoke about with the visitors was completely open. There were no restraints on that. And Soviet visitors, and I say Soviet because The exhibit was Russians, it was Uzbeks, Georgians, Ukrainians, throughout the entire breadth of the then Soviet Union. They came in by the thousands. They would the exhibit opened at 10 o'clock in the morning. They would line up in any weather, starting at midnight. They would pass through militia cars, pulled bumper to bumper, one by one, with militiamen, lecturing them about why aren't you at work, why aren't you at home, why aren't you in school, why are you coming to listen to this? But they persisted because they wanted to talk to an American. Now, why was that special or different? Now, it so happened that in the exhibit I was on, the American Home, I was on the very first exhibit or stand that a visitor would come to. And they would literally almost run into the exhibit to get to you. And they would start asking rapid fire questions. What about crime in America? What about racism? What about this? What about that? All the negative things that we're all very familiar with about American society. And I have to tell you, my first thought on the very first day, which was Tashkent, I thought, oh boy, this is going to be a really long day and a really long exhibit, if this is how it's going to go. But it turned out that even though they were asking about all the various flaws of American society, which are well known, they weren't trying to insult me or us or be difficult. What they were doing was they were raising the issues that they knew about, because of course the Soviet government, like the Russian government, tries to control what its people have access to. And they were much more successful back in those days, before the internet, before satellite television, before cell phones. They had a much greater ability to control access to information for their population. So what they were really saying, and sometimes they would say this to you once the conversation had gone on for a bit, look, I don't have a lot of time. I've never met an American before. I may never meet an American again, certainly not one who speaks Russian. So you have to help me out here. My government tells me this about America, but I know my government lies to me because they lie to me about my own life. The Kremlin lies to me about the cost of cars, or what apartments are like, or what food is in the stores. So if they're going to lie to me about my own life, of course they're going to lie to me about the United States, the class enemy. So your job, my very simple job is tell me the truth. Explain to me what it is really like in the United States, so I can put all of this propaganda I hear into some kind of context. And the key thing here, and I'm sorry for making this a long story, the key thing is here is we did not, if you will, counterpunch. We did not, if somebody said, for example, as we often heard on the exhibit, the United States did nothing in World War II. You collaborated with the Nazis while the Russians suffered. We didn't say, oh yeah, what about, or they said, they claim we have freedom of religion in Russia. We have no racism in Russia. We didn't argue with them. We just said, look, you want to know about life in America? I'll just tell you what I know. Here's my family. Here's who I am. Here's what I've done. Here's what I think. And when the Russians realized that you weren't just punching and counterpunching and going down a list of ideological talking points, you started to slow things down and have a real honest conversation with people. But as we were saying about public diplomacy versus dictatorships writ large, that takes time. But it's time that's well invested. It is gardening. It is, cultural, and it can succeed and prevail in the end. But those exhibits lasted for several decades, and then there came a great crash in public diplomacy at one point where they were done away with along with lots of other American public diplomacy projects and institutions for a variety of reasons. But let me stop there because again, I'm
a question or two. Do you, from your observation, we are all, of course, very concentrated on this horrible conflict that's now taking place. And Rick, like me, maybe you've been watching the many videos on the internet of Russian citizens being interviewed in the street. And what I get from them is absolute indifference. Do you think that the interest that when you were doing the exhibits in the 1970s and Russian citizens came up to you, Soviet citizens, with open, genuine curiosity, is it your impression that that would be the case now? Do you have any thoughts about that? Have things changed dramatically in the minds of Russian citizens?
No, I don't think so. I think it would still be the same today. I don't know if there's a need to go into a deep dive. We can all have our opinions on sort of whether or not there is such a thing as a good Russian. What do they think? What do they care about? Every society has its angels and its demons. I am familiar with America's angels and demons because this is where I live. I know a little bit about Russian angels and demons. I leave other countries to figure it out for themselves. Obviously, in America, let's be candid about this. Two of our greatest evils are racism and anti-intellectualism. And right now, we're seeing a combination of two of them working together and making for great difficulties day to day in American society. In Russian society, they also have their angels. Russians can be marvelous friends, true, deep friends. They are a cultured and educated people. They care about the arts. They care about thinking. They always have. One only needs to look at their art, their literature, their culture, their dance, their iconography, architecture. And the Russians have a tremendous capacity to suffer for what they think is right. I won't rehash what we know about World War II and so forth. But Russians also have, on the other side of the ledger, an ability to be indifferent and hard-hearted, if you want to be simple about it, to other people's suffering. That they really just don't seem to care if other people suffer greatly. And sometimes they excuse that by saying, well, you may be suffering, but you never suffered like we did. We always suffered worse. Well, that's hуже, The other thing is, Russians have too great a capacity to put up with, tolerate dictatorship. They're not fighting. They're not in the streets fighting for democracy. They know they don't have it. They know they don't have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. They don't have these things. They've never had these things, part of the problem. And they're not fighting for them in any overt, open way. They're just hoping that if they live their lives, have their families, raise their children, go to their jobs, maybe the government will just leave them alone and they won't have to pay attention to all the horrors that are around them. But those are things that Russian society has to work out over time. But anyway, I've gone far from the exhibit question, but the answer is yes, I think Russians would still be the same today.
Great. We have Maria with another comment. Let me first, again, let me first echo some of what we're hearing relates back to things we have heard. When we spoke to Tom Kent, the former director of Radio Free Liberty, he talked about the ease, now on the topic of propaganda, how easy it is to make a listener believe that they are the victim rather than somebody else. The idea of that dictatorships often use, we are being disadvantaged. We're being unfairly treated by the world. Of course, this is very much what Putin has been saying for 8 years now. And the effect and the extreme effectiveness of evoking victimhood. And then I will just also mention, I see Maria has a comment. I encourage others. I encourage any Ukrainian or anyone else on this call. How is Ukraine doing? Are they doing, what is your impression? We heard Paul Foldy, somebody asked him, how is President Zelensky doing in his public diplomacy? And he said, outstanding, a model of perfect public diplomacy. That's what Paul Foldy told us. I'm sure Rick knows Paul. He was one of a staffer who was always friendly to our budget. But I would ask anyone on the call, Ukrainian or otherwise, we know a lot about American public diplomacy. I don't know much about that of other countries. I know about the Confucius Institutes um, and the Pushkin Institutes, which go back many decades and which seem to be effective. But I don't know much about what Ukraine is doing. Ukraine does not have the luxury of spending much time on this and resources because they're in a terrible existential struggle. Maria, let's hear what you're thinking again.
Thank you. Well, I can quickly add my comment on your most recent question about Ukrainian public diplomacy, because today Zelensky announced a decree in which he orders a creation of sort of Ukrainian efforts of focusing the research abilities on the historic facts of Ukrainians being threatened or oppressed in the Russian territories, but on the territories which were historically settled by Ukrainians, so bordering regions, for example, and the Kuban region as well. So this could be sort of the Ukrainian attempt of not punching in response, but creating its own momentum. And my comment or question would be about the use of historic opportunities as a strength, or rather the lack of this strength in the West, because especially in the regards of Russia and the USSR, this comparison, because you said when you first visited the USSR, you never would have imagined its collapse. And nowadays we see a similar view of Russia by the European Union, by the USSR, by the USA, because in Ukraine, many people are completely okay with the idea of Russia collapsing and the indigenous people of Russia gaining deserved independence, because for many Ukrainians, the indigenous peoples of Russia are going through the same course that Ukraine went through historically. But I studied personally the European Union, and the rhetoric that I found there is the rhetoric of stability in Russia is good for the European continent. So we should sort of not play with fire in this case, and not play along with the independence movements inside of Russia. But does it mean that if historic opportunity of helping those nations become independent in case Russia starts collapsing will be lost while there is this culture of trying to preserve Russia?
Yeah, I mean, in full confession, I would love to see Russia collapse, although that's my heart. My mind tells me this could lead to some terrible problems. Wonderful observation, Rick. What do you say about the use of history as a way of not counterpunching, but rather projecting a genuine image of oneself?
No, I think that is excellent. I would also agree with you, with Maria, with my friend Paul Foldy and others. Zelensky is a man who has met the moment. He is a remarkable figure, and whatever the future holds, he will be seen as a remarkable figure in history for his vision and his ability to lead in such a difficult time. And I think that this latest decree, which I look forward to reading in more detail, is an example of that kind of forward thinking ability to not only deal with the moment, but to think beyond that. I would welcome the collapse of Russia. The people before the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, worried about exactly the same thing, that we're playing with fire, and we have to sort of let the Soviet Union exist or let it down gently because it has thousands of nuclear tipped weapons. It has one of the largest land armies in the world. It extends across 11 time zones. It controls the Warsaw Pact nations and all their militaries and population. So a collapse will bring vast suffering and disorder. None of that happened. In historic terms, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was almost bloodless. It happened in rapid time, largely peacefully, and the world is better off for its absence. Ronald Reagan was right. It was an evil empire. Russia still remains, in some ways, an evil empire. It is a country of conquest. I say that understanding that the United States, in its way, is also a country of conquest. We can talk about that. But as delightful, as marvelous historically to see Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs and others become independent, I would like to also see all the other rest. I would love to see Udmurts and Bashkirs and Tatars become independent and have their own nation. So I don't fear that, but obviously it would create difficult challenges. But Russia, back in the 19th century, was known as the prison house of nations, and in many ways it still is. But to go back very, very quickly to something Maria, you and Dan mentioned, and that is the power of playing the grievance card. That, of course, is what Hitler did in the 30s in the run-up to World War II. He told the Germans they had been mistreated, that they had been abused, that they were in fact the master race, but they had been kept down by evil design around them. And of course, that's the other part of the grievance card. And you have to understand that from a Russian perspective, they believe they have never been appreciated by the West. That whether that was Russia absorbing Tatars and Mongols and Genghis Khan and others coming from the East, and Russia absorbing them before they hit what we now think of as mainland or Western Europe, or the centers of European civilization and Christianity. Russia protected them by absorbing the terrible losses, or whether it was in World War II, where Russian losses from Germany's invasion were just unfathomable in terms of the suffering. One need only think of the siege of Leningrad. And that the West has never appreciated that we have always looked down upon them, sneered at them, thought they weren't as good as us, and yet they suffered. And so Putin knows how to play that card to keep Russians together and, if you will, subservient to his wishes in this area. It's a powerful, powerful card to play.
When you say let down Soviet Union gently, or you said something like that, let's remember how hard the collapse happened under the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush, who did a lot of the hard work invisibly. Ronald Reagan is associated with the decline of the Soviet Union. In fact, it was President Bush who actually did it with James Baker. And we know that when the collapse was imminent, or when it was happening, there was a lot of triumphalism in the West. People wanted to celebrate and to mention with praise this wonderful thing. President Bush, at the time, the older Bush, was very careful to say, we will not do that. We will not further humiliate them. And looking back, to me, that seems like an extremely wise policy, because further provocation would have increased the grievance narrative, I think. What Rick has just said, and I'll point out an irony or a paradox. We have three Kenyans on this call, and I'm guessing what they're thinking about the division of large countries into small countries. The African Union has a very strong policy of never changing borders, because the policy is that even though the borders in Africa are crazy and were basically created by arrogant Europeans in Berlin in 1884, even so, to change a border is likely to cause conflict. I'm not saying that to contradict you, Rick. I'm just saying that in another continent, the leading multilateral organization, the African Union, has a very strong policy. Don't mess with borders. That said, I I'm charmed by your vision of a future Russia, which is actually 15 different countries, where Wilson's 14 points, the groups are permitted to identify themselves in various countries. That the 14 points were never really a great success in implementation. But anyway, it could well be that this principle is needed and necessary in Africa, maybe not in Europe. Any person on this call, what are your thoughts about the information war, and let's just say it very directly, with Russia at this time? And we know that at some point, the terrible presence of Russia will be overtaken by a larger presence, which is China. And I believe that President Biden, I believe even now, his doctrine is the real challenge. We know that Russia's a big challenge, but the long-term challenge will be China. Do you have reflections on this? And I will ask, I think I know the answer to this question. Rick has kind of answered this, but in dealing with disinformation, of which we have tons and tons right now, you've said, let's see, use the expression, don't counterpunch. That said, Rick, what can be the role of public diplomacy in countering disinformation? Should it avoid doing so directly and do it indirectly? I'm guessing that that would be closer to your thinking.
You have to do both, Dan. Counterpunching is vitally important. I mean, for example, let's just take something that's slightly historic. It was the Soviet Union that spread the disinformation back when disinformation was a new thing. There was a time when, we didn't talk about it every day. And they began spreading the disinformation that the United States had developed the AIDS virus specifically to kill Africans. And they did it. They spread it in the way they still spread it. The playbook remains the same, and that is they would concoct a lie. The bigger, the better. A bigger lie is always better than a small lie. And they would plant it in a friendly newspaper like the Patriot in India, which is the most communist-owned newspaper. And then Pravda or Izvestia would say, oh, look, Western, the global media is reporting this. And then on it would go. And they still use that same playbook. So you have to counter these things. You have to rebut them. The thing is, one of the weaknesses I think we have in American public diplomacy is that we overemphasize the counterpunching. We overemphasize the rebuttal as necessary as it is, and we neglect the longer term process, which is the ultimate cure of the disease, which is to, have everybody be media literate, to be digitally literate, to understand what's going on, what the conflicting issues are, and make up their own minds independently. That's the educational process, and that necessarily takes longer. And I think we need to do more of that in the United States so that let's take a look at Ukraine. Obviously the cultural identity of Ukraine, which is the heart of this conflict, like the cultural identity of any society, any culture, stretches back into the past through its history, its culture, its religion, its monuments, its art, and it stretches forward into the future through the lives and opportunities and futures of its young people. That's true of every society. The State Department, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, works very closely with the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian organizations on both of those. So going back into the past, something that I think is very important, gets very little attention, is how much work we do with the Ukrainian government on protecting Ukrainian cultural heritage, whether that's emergency stabilization, whether that's archives and documentation, whether that's actually, restoration. But we work with the Ukrainian ministries and authorities, we work with the Smithsonian, we work with UNESCO and others to preserve that Ukrainian past. And it's worth mentioning here that, as Maria touched on also, Ukrainian history is not, simply Ukrainian. It is diverse. The U.S. government has helped working with the government of Ukraine to protect synagogues in Ukraine, to protect Tatar sites, to preserve, Cossack naval vessels that have been found. I mean, it's a diverse culture and past there. And then we work with Ukraine on the opportunities and future of young people by high school exchange, by Fulbright, by English language instruction, by educational advising, so that we do what we can to reinforce the fact that there will always be a rich, diverse, strong Ukrainian culture and society. But that, again, takes place over time. That's part of the marathon. But you have to counterpunch at the same time and not let lies go unopposed.
I have spoken with American officials in Kyiv about the Ukrainians that they are trying to reach. And I would say this must be one of the easiest jobs in the world, because Ukraine is so predisposed to take its own culture seriously. They don't need Americans to tell them that. They have the same values, we think, of democracy, free enterprise. I've been told by our American colleagues there that this is, as we call it, cakewalk, because Ukrainians are so positively predisposed. I guess my question would be, how is the Ukrainian government doing in getting the same narrative? We agree, the Americans and Ukrainians agree more or less on the Ukrainian narrative, but there are many countries that don't understand it or who oppose it. I would ask any person on this call, President Zelensky cannot do this all by himself. We know there's a foreign ministry. We know that Ukrainian diplomats are traveling extensively in the global south. It's remarkable that they have the time and the resources to do that. Can anybody on this call tell me and Rick, how is the Ukrainian government doing in sharing its narrative with wider audiences? We very much admire and we follow your president, but I personally am not aware of the exchange programs you may have, the educational cooperation. Can anybody enlighten me on this? And if not, we need to go to work and find out. Alina Shevchuk, you're on. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much. About exchange programs, of course, right now with the war, we cannot guarantee foreigners safe education and time spent in Ukraine. However, a lot of opportunities for Ukrainians are overseas. For example, last semester I've participated in Erasmus exchange program in the University of Bologna. So I had opportunity to talk on behalf of my country, to present it to some people, even explain Ukraine, what's the conflict. Some people had no idea that back in 2014, that was the moment when Russia first attacked Ukraine. And so I could explain to people both culture, language, our traditions, and how Ukraine is without war, but also the context of this fight for freedom. So I think it's also important for civilian students, for ordinary Ukrainians to talk about Ukraine on this regular level, to let people know what Ukraine is, that it's not just some gruesome and sad headline in your newspaper. There are people behind who have to live through this, but they still believe that there will be better times, that we will get through this.
Yeah. Rick, is this not a perfect example of people-to-people exchange? I'm a great admirer of the Erasmus program. As I understand it, it was created mainly for EU countries, but they have made a big exception for Ukraine. And I am so glad that that program has welcomed Ukrainian students in Western European countries. Rick, how does this strike you?
No, absolutely. Those are extremely good points. I mean, obviously, there's only so much that we, supporters, allies, friends of Ukraine, can expect Ukraine to do with regard to public diplomacy when they are at war. I mean, when you're at war, number one is, the war itself, the victims, the casualties, the violence that comes with the war. That has to absorb almost all the attention of Ukrainian leadership and Ukrainian people. I mean, even in certain things like the Fulbright program, which of course we continue actively with the Fulbright program, both digitally and in person with Ukraine. But Ukraine also has a law about men of a certain age not being able to leave Ukraine because they have military responsibilities to fulfill. I mean, first things must come first. There has to be a Ukraine, and it has to survive as a free Ukraine for anything else to matter. But to the extent that there is time and energy, and of course, Ukraine is paying attention to this. The decree, which was just mentioned earlier, is an important part of this. It makes me think of something that actually a Kazakh university student told me, a young woman, when I was speaking with her a couple of years ago. And she said, Kazakhstan is a landlocked country. We are far from every ocean. And if you look at human history, oceans are how people communicated, how they explored, how they contacted each other, and how they conducted commerce. And she said, for Kazakhstan, the internet is our ocean. That's how we reach the world. And I applaud Ukrainians for what they've been able to do online, electronically, digitally. And obviously more of that is possible, one hopes, with proper support and so forth. But to ask too much more of Ukraine in the public diplomacy area is probably something that we shouldn't ask that much. We should be hoping to make sure they prevail.
Very much understood. What we're doing, of course, with this course is, I won't say we have the luxury of having the time to study these things, but let's think of it as a luxury. We know that many or all of the people on this call will be involved in policy, either through the government or private NGOs. And so what we want to do with your help, Rick, and you have help, is to prepare for a time when there is less urgency and when there will be resources to do this. Before we get to Maria's next comment, let me just say, in the fall, I intended to have a few sessions on what we call PD strategy, or as the military calls it, strategic communications, or STRATCOM. I'd like to take Maria's question, and then after that, I'd like to ask Rick, what is a PD strategy? You've worked on this for 30 plus years. What are the approaches that work when you have to make the hard decisions of how to use limited resources? Let's go first to Maria and your comment.
I would like to ask a question which will not be in any shape or form connected to what we've discussed before, but it's connected to the biography that we had a chance to study of you. And it's mentioned that you worked in Saudi Arabia as well, if I'm not mistaken. And I have a question about the warming up of relationship of Saudi Arabia with Iran, and how do you view the reasons for it? Was it a success of Chinese diplomacy, mediation, or was it something else? Were there predispositions? Because it's personally for me, it came as a huge surprise, because as a student of international relations in Ukraine, we had a course on Middle East, and we always studied it as an axiom that Saudi Arabia and Iran are rivals historically, culturally, religiously, and so on.
Great question. It does seem incredible that this is happening.
Okay, so all right, this a couple of things. Shall I start with the Saudi Arabia question, and then we'll go to PD strategy?
Let's do exactly that. Thank you.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia, fascinating country, and Iran, fascinating country. I love to travel. Fortunate to be able to go to about 70 different countries so far. Hope there's still more in the future. But the one place I'll probably never get to go that would be number one on my list is Iran. Um, fascinating antique culture. And I would love to visit it. I think if there was an Academy Award, what we call an Oscar for the longest running stupid US foreign policy, it would probably be either Iran or Cuba.
Yeah, yes.
Probably Iran, because we, the United States, simply seems to be unable to get over the fact that we had the crisis with the hostages in the embassy, and we just won't let that go. As if reopening an American embassy in Iran was somehow a sign of weakness. Somehow we lost the battle with Iran if we opened an embassy there again, which is absolute madness. If we had an embassy in Iran, if we had contact with Iranians like we do with people in other countries, so that we talk to business people and leaders and civic leaders and students and professors and journalists, we would know so much more, have so much more of a profound, nuanced understanding of what's going on in Iran and how to deal with them than we do now, just watching them from a hostile distance, lobbing missiles at their Houthi allies. But so be it. Saudi Arabia and Iran, sure. This is ancient. I'm sure you all know. And if you go back in the history of Islam to the fundamental split between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, that is a fundamental, necessary understanding one has to have about all politics in the so-called Arab and Muslim world. And Saudi Arabia and Iran obviously are in a way the two chief protagonists or antagonists in that area. Why they would start to make motions towards each other is strictly in the most cold-blooded, realistic power politics sense. It's not that there's any diminution in their grievances with each other. It's not that one starts to see the light about, oh, maybe they have a good argument, maybe they have a good argument, maybe we were wrong. There's none of that. It's all about money. It's all about geography. It's all about power politics. It's about who's the missing party. Is it Israel? Is it the United States? Is it the day they think that oil runs out? I mean, again, it's all power politics, and I wouldn't pay too much attention to it on a day-to-day basis. It's going to have a long, rocky road. When I was in Saudi Arabia, women couldn't drive. All right, they can drive now. Things in Saudi Arabia move very, very slowly, and they obviously move slowly in Iran too. I mean, if you look at the internal politics just on the artistic cultural side, when I was in Saudi Arabia, no movie theaters, no concert halls, no public dancing, no public music, no public entertainment of any kind. My wife and I, if we were in Riyadh, the capital, could not go to dinner together at a restaurant. My wife could not drive a car. She could not take a taxi because the taxi driver was a male, of course, and it was against the law in Saudi Arabia for a woman to be in a car alone with a man who was not a relative. I mean, things change slowly. And in Iran, of course, they're arresting women, imprisoning them for not covering their hair with the hijab. So they've all got their own issues to work out, as we say, and it's fascinating to watch, but it's going to be slow going with lots of bumps in the road because they're not fundamentally seeking any kind of new rapprochement. They're just each trying to do what they think is best for themselves.
Since you do have insight in this region, Rick, I have to ask, if October 7th had not happened, Gaza, Israel, would the Abraham Accords have been imminently about to create a much friendlier relationship between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states? Do you think that was really going to happen?
I think that the fear of that was part of the reason for the October 7th attack, that the ultimate threat for Hamas and related terrorist groups are that that the big kids would get together, that the nation states, the oil states, the OPEC countries, the Arabic leaders, Saudi Arabia, the keeper of the two holy places, would somehow find a rapprochement with Israel. That was their ultimate fear. And I think that did help drive the timing of October 7th.
Yeah. Now, strategy, time permitting, I don't know about your schedule, but tell us, how does one make a public diplomacy strategy? What are the decisions one must make?
Well, I think the very first thing you have to do is you have to think like a general. If you are a military general, admiral, you're a military leader and responsible for military strategy, and you're contemplating an engagement of some sort, the first thing you do is you survey the terrain.
Mhm.
What are you facing? Deserts, mountains, rivers, deep water ports, population centers. What is the terrain? Where is the high ground? Where will your troops have to march? Where can your planes land? Where can your ships go? I mean, the most physically basic structure of the terrain on which you will engage the enemy. Well, if you're a public diplomacy strategist, you have to do the same thing from a public diplomacy perspective. What are your country's natural strengths, its natural advantages? Let's take the United States, for example. The United States has a number of natural advantages which would make the United States an attractive soft power country, even if the government didn't invest any money in it whatsoever. For example, American popular culture. Whether you love it or whether you hate it, American popular culture is the most widespread, most influential popular culture in the world. Whether that's Star Wars or Black Panther or Beyonce or Taylor Swift or whatever it happens to be, it's a fact on the ground. And if you're a public diplomacy strategist, you have to understand that, and you have to understand what that means about how people look at America and how does that factor into your plans. America has one of the most attractive, widespread systems of higher education in the world. We're still the #1 destination for young people from around the world seeking a higher education, and that's an important factor to understand. For example, just as a sidebar, vis-a-vis China. I mean, most of the headlines in the media are about US and China being at conflict with each other in some long-term way. But the #1 country for sending its best and brightest young people to the United States to go to the university is China. So what does it tell you that hundreds of thousands of young Chinese men and women spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years living and studying in the United States before they go back to China? So how do you factor in that equation? Entrepreneurship. There's a reason, again, love him or hate him, there's a reason Elon Musk is in the United States. There's a reason that all the major tech companies are in the United States. There's a reason for that. And part of that is the entrepreneurial culture, which attracts people who want to get away from being identified with a race, a religion, an ethnicity, and they just want to pursue their own dream, whether it's greed or whether there's some more noble purpose. And I'll just say one more thing, and that is the language we're all speaking right now. It hasn't always been the case. It probably won't always be the case, but right now, English is the lingua franca of the world, particularly in technology and business and STEM. And young people everywhere know that English is a language that lets you pretty much go anywhere and do anything. So if you're a public diplomacy strategist, to get back to Dan's good question, you have to look at these natural advantages the United States has in the same way a general looks at natural advantages like seizing the high ground or the passes between the mountains, which helped Hannibal get to Rome. That's the first thing you do. So what are Ukraine's natural advantages or strengths? What are Kazakhstan's? What are Kenya's? What are any country we're talking about? They will have certain natural advantages, and you want to take what are always limited resources, limited governmental resources, and apply them in a way that enhances those already existing advantages, puts wind in your sails, you might say. Anyway, let me stop there.
Oh no, but then the tools, the general in the battle looks for the high ground, but then what? I mean, the right flank, the left flank, yeah.
For example, in the particular case of Ukraine, it is not necessary, as a couple people have already alluded to sort of persuade the world about what is happening here. It is well understood by anybody who's not bought off that Ukraine is the victim, that Ukraine is being punished for its desire to be free and independent, have its own destiny and its own democratic values, and that Russia is the brutal aggressor here. So they don't have to have a public diplomacy strategy per se to convey that message. There are other, for example, there are other conflicts in the world that people understand far less and get far less attention. If you ask people what is going on in Myanmar, you're not going to get a lot of recognition. If you ask who the Houthis are, people are not going to know. But if you ask people around the world what is happening in Ukraine, by and large, they will all tell you that a Russian aggressor attacked Ukraine because they can't bear the thought that Ukraine could have an independent democracy of its own, not subservient to Russia. So the big issue is already settled. Then the question is, how do you maintain it and sustain it over time? And the kind of thing that Maria mentioned about President Zelensky's new decree on looking forward post-conflict, those are the kinds of far-reaching, far-seeing things that I think are the most important, but they all are based on, Ukraine being a robust, democratic country, where people are free to pursue their lives, their ideas, their future, live their culture.
Has everybody noticed Rick has not talked about the toolkit, because I believe that's because he takes that as secondary to the concept that you need to. The toolkit will maybe solve itself. The usage of bursaries, scholarships, giving people travel opportunities. These things, I'm very struck by what we've just heard, because it's a grand strategy. It's in the sense of Kennan, to understand what your resources are as a culture, to understand what your goals are. The rest of it is and should be secondary, I think. We had Abisagi Boyani from Kenya who had a comment. Abisagi, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, and we welcome you. Yeah.
Thank you. Great discussions we are having here. I just want to reflect on what you mentioned around the disinformation in Africa, and the question that you slightly mentioned, what we think about why we don't have, I call it annexation tendencies. I'm not quite sure, but it has provoked me to examine our colonial history, having that we had a lot of the French, we have a lot of Francophone in the west of Africa, and the British, we tended to have taken the east mostly. We have a few Germans and Spanish towards the west, and also around the British territories. But I want to think that since those territories were set then, and I believe they claimed them through the indigenous leaders at that time, considering we've had a lot of issues to deal with after even colonialism, we've not had time to start thinking to annex each other's country. And the fact that we didn't have one specific country, let's say a whole Africa colonized by the French or the British, then it could have been possible that we would have started having annexation tendencies, rather territory, not integrity, zero integrity, because then we would say we are one thing. We belong to each other. So if I extend towards you, we have one colonial master. But then again, it doesn't completely rule it out, because currently we are seeing slight tendencies to invade each other because of the natural resources that we have around Uganda, Rwandese borders, DRC Congo. We are starting to have issues because of the natural resources that are there, not completely exploited. And I don't pray for a future where we are starting to annex each other, because we already have a lot of issues to deal with. We have our internal wars, we have continuous poverty, we're even dealing with disinformation currently. And for us, if I now proceed to disinformation, Russian disinformation in Africa, it's slowly growing. And majorly in the Sahel region, we've seen a couple of coups, attempted coups, successful coups, and changes of even the names of the Russian groups we have here. The Wagner group, we now have what we call, I think, Africa Corps. And we are not safe, we are not an exception, but I think the solution around Africa would be, like our guest speaker mentioned, to exploit media literacy and educational process of our people slowly, even as the internet grows rapidly within the continent. I think that would be the best. And of course, that will lead to us debunking all this disinformation we have around. And yeah, in regards to the saint Russian and the villain Russian, I have personally not met a Russian. I met one last year. That was my first time. I even had to tell her, it's the first time I'm meeting a Russian in Kenya. I've never come across a Russian. And when I had that debate of, there's the good and bad in a society. So who is the good Russian? What are Russians saying about Ukraine? Is there the good Russians and the villain Russian? I wouldn't have much to say, but I would have wanted to know. Like he mentioned that we have this going on, we have the good ones and we have the bad ones, patriotic ones, and those that they're extending their sympathies and towards the Ukrainians. And yeah.
Abisagi, thank you so much for a comment that reminds us that what we're dealing with is not simple. The existence of so-called good Russians and so-called bad Russians. It's fascinating that you had a first conversation. In fact, folks, it's been 9 successful coup d'etat in 18 months, mainly in the Sahel, but also in Sudan. Let me quickly add the Horn of Africa, which is a big problem. The best resource the world has in solving problems of the Horn is the country of Kenya. It's a country that still has challenges, obviously, but it's not crazy. It has an educational system. It's not aggressive, and it is an economic powerhouse. Even though it may not seem so to individual citizens, the GDP of the country is exemplary compared to the dysfunctional countries around it. You say you're not into annexation. That's a great thought. Tell that to Tigrayan or to an Ethiopian or to somebody from Somaliland, and they might have a different way of looking at it. I just want to say how much I admire the path that Kenya is taking right now, and the hope that we have that Kenya can be the anchor of a future Horn area, which is mainly just problems. Also reminding you, Abhisag, do you know, I know that RT, Russia Today, was actually building an office in Nairobi. Do you have any idea if that has been completed? Have they done that? I know that's the plan. They built one in Johannesburg with plans to be in Nairobi. So the Russians are very interested in all of Africa, and they see Africa, I think, as vulnerable. And I would hate to think that there would be a new recreation of a colonial pillage of the continent. Anyway, Rick, we've heard a lot from Abhisaki. Do you have any thoughts that are stimulated by Abhisaki's comments? We don't do annexations, but we do have regional conflicts competing over natural resources. What is one to make of all of this?
I mean, those are very good comments, and I greatly appreciated hearing them. You know, human beings are human beings. There's not going to be a time in our future where there is no conflict, where human beings are not fighting each other. That's not going to happen. So if you're waiting for that, you can stop waiting. The Garden of Eden is gone, won't come back. But I do believe, along with Martin Luther King, that while the arc of history bends very slowly, it bends towards justice. And I believe that if we continue to give the African nations and the African peoples themselves enough time and don't meddle further, as the Russians are meddling, whether it's with disinformation or the Wagner group of mercenaries, that of course the African nations and the people in Africa will sort this out, recovering from the absolutely horrendous history of European colonization and the American slave trade in Europe. I mean, Europe and the United States can't walk away from any of this, but we need to give the African peoples and nations the time, the support, the space they need to sort this out. And it will take time, but they're well on their way to do it. To come back to Russia for a moment, and perhaps looking at Africa as well as the rest of the global South, and thinking particularly with Ukrainian participants, Russia is nobody's idea of the future. There is no country that I'm aware of, and I'm happy for somebody to point out somebody who is, because you should never say never, but there's pretty much no country or society in the world that looks to Russia and says, we want to be like that. Not culturally, not politically, not socially, not scientifically, not anything. That's what we want to be like. We want to be like Russia in the future. And Russians know that. The Kremlin knows that, which is why they have no option in the world except to make trouble. When I talked about America's natural advantages, and other countries could do the same, that they offer educational opportunities, they offer business and entrepreneurial opportunities, they offer opportunities simply to live your life. Do you want to have a say? In other words, these don't have to be labeled as Western values or American values. These are human values. If you ask most people anywhere in the world, do you want to have a say in who runs your government? Sure, I'd like to have a voice in that. Do you want to be able to read any book you would like, go to see any movie or concert you would like? Sure. Do you want to be able to associate with anybody in your country, to be your friend as you choose? Of course I like that. You want to be able to travel and come and go freely? Of course I want that. Everybody wants those individual freedoms that reflect the worth and dignity of every individual. That's not what you get in Russia. That's not where they are. God willing, they'll be there someday, but they're not there now. So nobody sees Russia as their ideal or their model for future development. And that's why Russians only make mischief, or in the worst case scenario, do what they've done in Ukraine, which is simply militarily invade with untold atrocities. The Russians are spreading disinformation in a way because they know they have already lost the battle. They've already lost. Nobody wants to be like them. So all they can do to preserve their vaunted pride and power and place in the world is to make trouble for everybody else.
You've made your personal history, Rick, is fascinating because you were drawn to the Soviet Union because of your positive contact with individuals in that country. Your views have evolved, obviously. I thank you for saying so openly that the only resource they have is to make trouble. I absolutely agree with that. And we really thank you for all of this really stimulating thought. I want to remind everybody on the call, in your Google Classroom, you will see a link that I've posted of a cartoon where Rick was once giving a talk to professionals in the field of public diplomacy in the US. I believe these were grantee organizations, I think. But he gives the best history in 30 minutes that I have ever heard. And the brilliant cartoonist fills in and shows in images what Rick is saying. You'll find this in the Google Classroom. It's just 30 minutes long. We did not get into the details, the toolbox, the names of the different programs. And that's the quickest way to learn about American public diplomacy is to just view that video. Let me also mention next Monday, we will have Ambassador Beth Van Schaak. She is the lead in the US government on war crimes tribunals. She's a remarkable public official who very much wants to meet you. I'm very excited that she's agreed to take 45 minutes. She can't take an hour. She's kind of busy dealing with war crimes, of which there are, 100,000 cases in Ukraine alone. And I know that the Ukrainian Justice Ministry is working very hard on this. And it's an uphill battle. It's very difficult to construct a convincing case that will stand up in court in 100,000 different cases. We know that the ICC has indicted Putin and his minister for children, who's basically guilty, we think, of abducting Ukrainian children, which is a war crime. So I'm very excited to have Beth Van Schaak join us next Monday. I thank everybody. Thanks to everybody on this call who has listened or who has contributed. And thank you, Rick Ruth, for a very rich session.
Thanks to all of you. My pleasure.
Okay. See you next Monday. See you next Monday. Bye, everybody.